very much, Chair. It's a fantastic discussion, and it's helpful, I think, that we've hit upon some of the difficulties, some of the more difficult aspects that we face as socialists and as anti-war activists. On the arms question, I mean, let's look at it quite practically. Ukraine is being armed. I mean, the Ukrainian state is already being armed, and it has been armed every year since 2014. It's a major recipient of US military aid. Now, there's the whole question about whether Ukraine should, will, or could be in NATO. I think we've gone through that. And privately, everybody in power accepts that it can't be in NATO. So on one level, and this came out in the talks process last week, on one level, the path to a negotiated settlement ought to be fairly clear. However, Ukraine might not be in NATO, but NATO has been in Ukraine since 2014. It's been training Ukrainian forces, arming Ukrainian forces, and Ukrainian forces have been deployed in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Now, we can say what we like about self-determination, but I don't believe that there is a socialist principle that you can self-determination equals taking arms and being trained by the major imperialist state to help out in its imperialist policing operations, all under the umbrella of the idea that that we are entitled to do that because we can determine what we want to do. And when we say we, it's not democratically the Ukrainian people as a whole, taking into account the fact that there are linguistic and national minorities. It is one set of very rich authoritarian people in Ukraine against the previous set of largely rich and authoritarian people in Ukraine. And so I think we have to put the politics front and center. We don't have any arms to send. NATO has already armed Ukraine and is arming Ukraine. The real thing is the politics around this. And somebody, I forget who it was, won't try to remember, made a good point I saw on social media a couple of days ago, which is almost at every time you hear that there is a breakthrough or some tentative agreement in the talks process, which is kind of on and off, you hear from Joe Biden or from Boris Johnson something which is utterly inflammatory. I mean, last week it was just at the point when the Russian and Ukrainian negotiators had said, there's a tentative outline agreement. Joe Biden said that Vladimir Putin is a war criminal. Now, in my view, all of them are war criminals, but I'm not hearing from Joe Biden about somebody else being a war criminal, or from Tony Blair about being a war criminal, or any of these people who supported a succession of wars over the course of the last 20 years and justify all of the ones before that and so on. And so I think politically, that's where we have to hit. There's some other things we could say about as well about what would really signal to people in Ukraine and in Russia an alternative. And one of them is this huge financial power which the US and its allies have just deployed in sanctions which hit ordinary Russian people, forget about the very rich people for a moment, could also be used overnight to wipe out the debt of the Ukrainian state. All the corporations, mining and agribusiness, which have gone into Ukraine from the West in order to try to make a huge profit, could be told that you will now have to surrender those investments to a government which truly has the support of people in Ukraine. Now, the West isn't going to do that because it's fighting for capitalist objectives and its own capitalist objectives, and it is fighting in this, even if it's not directly fighting. And that raises really the last point I want to make, which is that somebody mentioned, I think it was Angela mentioned Lenin earlier. And one of the points that Lenin made about war in general, often discussing different wars, is that foreign affairs, foreign wars, are part of domestic politics. They are part of Irish politics, even if Ireland is not in NATO, certainly firmly part of the European Union. And so all of these politics and political discussions are alive, including the pressure, as people have said, for Ireland to join NATO. And therefore, the biggest thing that we can do, when people are talking about an anti-war movement and the impact on the working class and the trade unions and the probably a recession, certainly inflation that's coming down the pipeline, the biggest thing we can do is to try to accelerate and generate as much as we can left forces in the class struggle. And in that, so just the final point, somebody said, what would be the good slogans of an anti-war movement? And we've heard them of in the immediacy over this war is no to war, Russia out of Ukraine, no NATO expansion. But more generally, I think we need to have a movement which says that we can stop war. We can try to stop and fight to stop all of these imperialist wars, and that's connected with a world where we get rid of the capitalist and imperialist dynamic at the center of the system. And those are all nice and fancy words, but I think if you went to your next door neighbor and asked people, what do you think about the state of the world? What do you think about this war and what's happening to working class people in Ireland? They wouldn't be that much different from us in the general sentiment. Quite different in understanding, of course, quite different in terms of that. But I think we have to really fight for a left which puts that front and center, the good sense of working class people. Because actually, when you look across Europe, the good sense of most working class people, I think, is better than the bad politics of an awful lot of the left at the moment.